Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this briefing session. My name's Stedman Ellis. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Future Battery Industries Cooperative Research Centre. We're a CRC whose mission is very timely, supporting the creation of new industry and new investment in Australia by leveraging Australia's competitive strengths in the global battery value chain. I'm pleased so many of our participants were able to dial in today and that some of them are here in the room with us in Perth today. They're the people we're trying to help in this journey as a cooperative research centre and deliver outcomes that enable them to grow their businesses. I'd acknowledge that we meet on the land, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The report we're about to hear about today is a foundational one for the CRC, both in terms of the contribution it will make to the focus of the investment that the CRC makes over the remaining 5 years of our life, but also in terms of how we measure the impact of the CRC at the end of that investment period. I hope many of you have had the opportunity to download the report and have a read of it, and I think we'll all enjoy the opportunity to hear from Chris Vernon and Adam Best, who will take us through the report. The approach to this morning's session will be Adam and Chris will take us through the report. We'll then move to a panel discussion with the opportunity for questions, both for those of you online as well as for those of you in the room. And Jack Eckstein, the CRC's Chief Operating Officer and Research Director, will join the panel discussion that we'll have. Very briefly, some words about Chris Vernon and Adam Best. Chris has been involved in or led CSIROs mineral processing research program for more than 30 years. He's had a particular focus on battery minerals and graphite, including taking it through to battery-grade metals. Adam Best, Principal Research Scientist within the CSIRO Manufacturing Division. Adam is involved in a number of novel research projects around electrolytes, anodes and battery concepts. We're lucky both of them came together and brought their expertise in this report. They're both passionate about the opportunity to connect Australian companies and policymakers to the opportunities in the global battery value chain. So I think the report and the opportunity to hear from Chris and Adam and ask them questions is an important one.
Thanks very much, Stedman. And thank you to the FBICRC for making this possible, for supporting the work. And Adam and I would like to thank a whole bunch of people in CSIRO who helped out along the way. Adam is at a bit of a disadvantage today because he's in lockdown in Melbourne, so whether he appears with a mask or not, I'm not sure. Much of this report was written during lockdown, and during lockdown we all had a lot of time to think about things, and I think one of the nicest quotes I read during that time was from the Executive Director of the exactly what it is, the International Energy Agency. And he really said, during this time when the world was in change and we didn't know what was happening with oil prices, we didn't really understand, how the world would be, it's a perfect opportunity to change things, to move to doing things a bit differently, embrace green energy as a source of jobs and deliver to climate goals. And so during this time we wrote down and penned out a few things that are at the beginning of the report, which are that Australia fundamentally has a lot of potential, and we've got a really big, probably once in a generation opportunity to do something at the moment with battery industries. We were concerned that maybe we can't act quickly enough to get ahead of the game, and we were sort of wondering how far we should go. So as an introduction to the report, as Stedman said, it's a snapshot in time of the battery industries in Australia, very much intended to be the benchmark, what is it now, and measure what we do in the future. And It surveys a lot of mostly publicly available information. Occasionally we've had to make phone calls to friends in industry to say, please help us out. We don't quite understand what's happening. And we've also had a look at some of the policy settings and an analysis of what other nations are doing who are on this trail. Now, it's always really comforting to find out that there are other nations who are on this trail. It means that we're not completely crazy. Very roughly, content of the talk, I won't labour over that because it'll become quite obvious as we get to each point. I'm going to hand over to Adam Best now, who's going to talk about the next few slides to talk about the battery value chain.
Thanks very much, Chris. So the battery value chain can be pretty much sliced and diced in many different ways, and we've decided to partition the various aspects of the value chain up, as you see here on the wheel, into mining and concentration, refining and processing, battery materials, cell manufacture and testing, pack assembly and testing, and of course recycling. Obviously, our strengths, as we demonstrate in the report, is all around the mining and concentrating process. But we do acknowledge, as you'll see as we go further down in the report, that refining and processing is an emergent industry as much as battery materials are as well. And further, there is also a huge opportunity for us to enter the battery manufacturing story. Next slide, Chris. So for those of you who may not be familiar with how batteries work, on the left there we have an image of a redox flow battery, and on the right we have an image of a lithium-ion battery. The key point here is that batteries are defined essentially by the electrodes and the operating voltage between them. So the image, particularly for the lithium-ion battery, defines that the specific capacity or the energy stored is by the materials, and depending on the voltage difference between the two, you can then obviously further improve the energy density. Essentially, the math is capacity times voltage. And for this reason, lithium-ion batteries are king, and that's because they have the widest operating voltages possible. On the left, I also demonstrate the redox flow battery, the very different style of battery, one that Australia is also well known for and pioneered. And the key of this device is not the electrodes that define the energy here, it's the actual electrolyte. So it's a very different type of concept. But the key point here is that the materials and elements within the battery are obviously raw battery metals. In the case of lithium-ion, it's nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, aluminium, copper. In the case of the redox flow systems, we have obviously different metals, including vanadium and others, but there are many battery metals which are required in order for these devices to be able to be used. So we can then move to the next slide. We've set out here the cumulative demand moving forward from a Bloomberg New Energy Finance plot here describing the battery demand and segmenting this via companies. We have focused here essentially on energy storage rather than automotive, and that's because Australia has a strong opportunity to play in this space. And the criticality of that is that we are obviously one of the world's leaders in terms of energy storage on the grid with the adoption of the Tesla battery at the Hornsdale Power Reserve, which was the first of its type and has since spurred significant investment more broadly. But there are also other opportunities for behind-the-meter storage in both residential, commercial and industrial. So we see here in Australia that the key opportunity for us is in this market segment because as we all know, Australia no longer has a vehicle industry, but we also wish to acknowledge that the driver for innovation and development is clearly automotive, as we seek to have much longer range batteries, lighter and more efficient technologies to power our transport future. Next slide. In our next slide, we'd like to present a plot from the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, which sets out one of their three policy positions around the adoption of various energy storage technologies. And you'll see in this plot that the actual dominant energy storage technology here is actually pumped hydro energy storage over a range of different timescales. However, in the middle of that plot, at the bottom and baseline, you'll see that there is a slow purple area, which is the large-scale battery contributions to the grid. But just above that is also another market segment, which is what are known as behind-the-meter batteries, or batteries that should be attached to either residential, industrial, or commercial. And you'll note in that plot that there's actually a growing demand forecast in the future to be connected to the grid, and this will be to connect to Australia's huge solar energy storage generation on our rooftops. So we see there a huge opportunity for Australia to actually continue to have more batteries installed on the grid moving forward in order to support those technologies. There's also, beyond that, issues of sovereign capability, and this is particularly other areas beyond mining and defence. And also within the low emission statement, we also see that, which was recently released by the government, that they wish to see opportunities for energy storage at below $100 per megawatt hour. And as part of that target, they also see batteries being a considerable part of that. Next slide.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'll take over for a little while now. I think one of the things we knew before we started this work was that Australia punched above its weight in supply of raw materials. But it's always good to sanity check that. 85% of global lithium comes from Australia, Chile and China, but the vast majority of the world's lithium comes from Australia. There's a wonderful statistic that 100% of battery-grade graphite comes from China. That's true, but it isn't all mined in China. Graphite does the production of the battery-grade graphite. Nickel, as Elon Musk noted a few years ago, we shouldn't call them lithium batteries, they're nickel graphite batteries. True, nickel is the most important by mass in the battery. Use of cobalt is decreasing, but Australia is actually the dominant supplier of nickel to the world's batteries. It's not because Australian nickel is special, it's because we just sell into the right markets who turn it into battery-grade nickel salts. Cobalt, yeah, it's all mostly mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we know that we'd like to compete with supply out of there for various reasons. We have a lot of bauxite and alumina. China turns that into foils, which turn into batteries. And China dominates the supply of vanadium, and there are a lot of big flow vanadium batteries in China. China doesn't necessarily dominate the mining. Australia's got a massive amount of vanadium that we currently don't extract and export. So, Australia is a place that produces a lot of battery materials. Geoscience Australia will tell you a lot of good statistics about the manganese, nickel, lithium, cobalt, natural graphite that we have in this country that's there for the taking. Unfortunately, with manganese, it's mostly these days put into materials that go to make steel. Lithium, as we know, mostly gets exported to China to be made into batteries. Cobalt, we don't currently dig much up. There's a little bit comes out of both Nickel West and out of Murrin, but not a significant supply. And natural graphite, we do have a lot of it, but we don't actually do anything with it at the moment. So apologies, there's some small writing on there, but in mining and refining, the usual culprits in Australia, lithium, we export a 6% concentrate, and the major player there is Talison. And you can read as well as I can, but nickel is big. Manganese, there's a lot of manganese. Cobalt, nobody's actually producing yet. Well, sorry, there are small production. There is no specific cobalt production. Bauxite, forget it. There's so much aluminium in this country that it's not even worth talking about. Natural graphite, a lot of it in WA and South Australia. but none produced at the moment. Vanadium, as I said, none produced at the moment. Copper, one of the essential elements in making a battery. There's plenty in Australia, but nothing processed to the point where you could make a battery. Good news is, though, that there are a lot of companies that are looking at moving along the value chain, and this is a list of companies that have got various focuses, from nickel and cobalt battery-grade materials through to new lithium technologies, and down in Kwinana, Ecograph are looking to build a plant where they're going to make battery-grade graphite. So all of that is really good. Gives you a good feeling that there are companies in Australia that are going to be taking advantage of the growing markets. I think I'm handing to Adam to talk about precursors.
You are. So, we're waxing lyrical here. So we're moving further from battery-grade chemicals to precursors obviously requires further processing, and this is where we see the beginning of effectively advanced manufacturing. And this is just due to the rigorous processes that battery cell manufacturers require for materials to be qualified for use in their cells, which can in some instances take multiple years. And further, the quality assurance and quality control requirements are also extremely onerous in order to meet these demands. As an example, you'll see here, most of the companies that you'll see listed here are actually natural graphite producers, and there is a real opportunity for Australia to move downstream in terms of processing from natural graphite concentrate to a spheronized, purified, and even coated graphite that can be integrated straight into batteries. And an example of this is obviously Talga Resources, who are a partner of the CRC, who have producing graphite from their Swedish mine and are moving towards production of anode materials for batteries in Germany. There remains a strong opportunity here in Australia for the same thing to occur, and there are obviously clear opportunities there as well. In terms of other technologies, we note the Antio Technologies, who are working on coating technologies for silicon graphite anodes, which is a real important technology for higher energy lithium-ion systems. We also note Sycona Battery Technologies is also trying to achieve similar targets. And then we also look at VSPC, or the Very Small Particle Company, a subsidiary of Lithium Australia, who are trying to choose lithium iron phosphate, which has recently reached even greater prominence due to the use of that material in Chinese Tesla Model 3 cars. And we should also note that in the area of cathodes, the FBICRC has put together a consortium to allow Australia to be able to manufacture the nickel, manganese, cobalt materials, which are now the bedrock of most vehicle technologies. If we move across to the next slide, slide 14, you'll see that in the space of cell manufacturing, we have obviously one established player in Australia, which is P&B Defence, who are the manufacturer of Australia's submarine battery technology, which is based on lead acid and has been done for many, many years. We have Redflow, who produces a vanadium redox flow technology, and that's obviously headquartered in Brisbane, but manufactured out of Thailand. But obviously the two biggest ones are obviously Energy Renaissance and Imperium 3, who have been discussing the proposed lithium-ion battery manufacturer in Australia. And hopefully in the near future we'll hear more on that topic. Next slide, Chris. So within that value chain that we showed you earlier in the presentation, we've triaged the Australian activity across ranges of the value chain, and you'll see here that in mining we have quite a large number of companies, and some companies we've also grouped with the refining and processing area, and further again into the battery materials area. Some companies are actually quite vertically integrated in those activities. Within the cell manufacture area, we've also included other companies such as CapX, who obviously do a supercapacitor technology, but it is electrochemical energy storage. Within the pack assembly, we have Equals, an Australian company packaging lead acid technology. Soluna, another subsidiary of Lithium Australia, doing the battery storage for residential. Sonnen out of South Australia. doing battery assembly. But then we also have all the electrification and charging systems around automotive, where Australia is a very strong player. And obviously the last step in this value chain is obviously recycling. We have companies such as EcoBat, EnviroStream, and others. Next slide. Connecting back to the slide earlier around the AEMO story, we in the report, we've triaged a whole range of different battery technologies, but we did want to draw people's attention to the fact of the large-scale energy storage, where batteries that are actually connected to the National Energy Market, or the NEM. And you can see here that we have 215 megawatt hours of batteries currently connected to the grid, and which will be expanding shortly with the expansion to the Hornsdale Power Reserve and another battery coming online. And the recent report was also in the AFR of even Western Australia now looking to get in on having a big battery. Hopefully, when they get round to doing that, that will be using Australian cell technology. On the next slide, we'll move to EV charging, and here is an area where Australia is really punching above its weight. And within the first low emissions technology statement, which was released by the Minister recently in September, they even talk about the government's future fuel strategy, and they're looking to promote the uptake of vehicle technology, and this also includes charging infrastructure. And charging infrastructure is really important if we're to see a greater uptake of electric vehicles. I think we would all be remiss not to suggest that charging times are still not ideal for what we would like to have. So any improvements we can do in that area are obviously will be welcome. But we'd also like to point out in this slide that there are some companies here who are really punching well above their weight and are actually delivering competitive technologies globally, and this includes companies such as Tritium. I'll hand you back to Chris.
Thanks very much, Adam. Adam and I were actually on the phone late yesterday talking about, how much dirt do you have to move to make a battery? And we were looking at some of the very large battery installations, and sort of it became mind-boggling, the mountain of dirt that you had to move to actually make one of these large batteries. And it really brought home that recycling is just so important. Recycling's not a threat to the primary industry. It actually prolongs the primary industry, because nobody's going to try and engineer your product out because they're not going to be able to get any more of it. So recycling makes a lot of sense on a lot of levels. At the moment, the collection for recycling of lithium-based batteries in Australia is really poor. Only about 2% get recovered. The rest goes to landfill, and that's either through the consumer not understanding or it's just too hard. We need some more, best practice guidelines. We need better collection systems. We need to actually get, the Australian people on board with battery recycling. So that social end of it is quite important. Fortunately, a lot of the battery importers and equipment manufacturers in Australia have got on board and put together the Battery Stewardship Council, and I understand that's currently looking for some legislative approval on a scheme where batteries landed in Australia will be charged a fee, and that fee goes into a central pot, and then if you're a battery collector, you get $2.40 for every kilo of batteries that you collect. Suddenly I can see school kids becoming battery collectors because there's actually money in it now. And if you are sorting the batteries, because there are many different types of batteries that you might not process the same way, if you're a sorter, you get $1 a kilo. I see another business there. And if you're actually doing some processing, there's another $1 a kilo. So it actually turns into a very small impost on a battery, but it creates a whole new industry. We looked at the Australian research landscape, and we found that a lot of institutions were interested, and obviously we've got a lot of those institutions involved in the FBICRC. We thought that the CRCP program was actually quite a good proxy, and CRCPs are a bit different, a bit important, because you need at least 2 industry participants. You need at least 1 researcher participant. and it's competitive. And we found that 15 institutions are currently working with 38 companies on 14 battery-related projects. And the cost of that is around about $79 million. So that's actually quite a good proxy for the amount of effort that's going on in Australia. And there's no shortage of research capability and various avenues to find funding through ARC, ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, as well as CRCs. Looking at the policy settings though, we tend to agree with Jeffrey Wilson out of UWA that we do have this world-class, wonderful environment for mining. Why would you mine anywhere else? Well, except perhaps Saskatchewan, which has a better regime. But when it comes to doing research and moving the industry along, there are no battery-specific policy settings in Australia. So all of those CRCPs are out there competing with every other type of manufacturing, every other type of mining, every other type of processing. So we think that it's actually a bit of a miracle that the battery industry and battery-related research has done so well in Australia to attract quite so much funding, because this is not a country that is currently favouring batteries and everything to do with batteries. And we'll get on to a bit of a discussion about that in a moment. Here we go. Quicker than I thought, quicker than I remembered. You can see that here's a compilation of European countries and Australia and what governments are throwing at battery initiatives. Now, throughout Europe, everybody's looking at electric mobility and going green and storing wind and solar energy. And there's quite a lot of activity. In Finland, there's nearly $2.5 billion Australian dollar equivalents being thrown at the issue by the government, and they've set up Batteries from Finland. It looks like a little company website, but it's actually driven by the Finnish government, and their intention is to establish some big battery industries over there. Sweden is not throwing nearly as much in, but very significant money. The United Kingdom, I would have thought they had no resources. They're still really interested in building batteries. And Germany's putting nearly, well, it's $850 million towards the initiative. And it seems that occasionally in Germany, they offend somebody by not giving them funding, so they find more funding to give the next person. So that's constantly growing. So batteries are really important to Europe. And looking at what Australian government initiatives throw towards batteries, it's about $150 million. Australia is one of those wonderful level playing field jurisdictions where we think that if it is truly worth doing, then private industry will pick up the ball. And I'm a strong believer in that, but I'm just looking at the amounts of money that are being put in overseas. I wouldn't call them competitors, I'd call them fellow travellers at the moment, because they are still embarking on a journey like we are. And rather than see this as a threat, I actually see it as an opportunity, that every one of those countries that wants to build batteries needs nickel and lithium and cobalt and graphite. We're going to be a great source of that, but wondering at where is the entry point in the value chain for us? Is it supplying the raw materials, or is it supplying something a little bit more finished than that? I've given a quick diagram here talking about the value chain in Australia and project investment from the FBICRC. The little cells up the top tell you, what is the level of activity and capability at the moment. A full cell, we're charging ahead. Nothing in the cell, well, maybe we've got something to do, and you can see there's a hole in the middle. We've got a lot of capability and activity and good potential for economic growth in mining and concentrating. Things start to fall away when you get to battery chemicals and making precursors and cells. Pick up, in fact, quite surprisingly, in battery assembly and deployment, because those are areas where we take batteries, cells, probably made overseas, and turn them into devices that are appropriate for Australia, for defence applications, for mining applications, for large-scale storage applications. And you can see, and I don't expect you to read the words there with the FBICRC projects, but there's a sort of a corresponding balance of what the CRC is trying to achieve to improve the state of knowledge and capability within Australia. So I guess our key messages are that, you know, we're already a sort of a global superpower when it comes to mining things that go into batteries. We've got a really strong research infrastructure and a lot of willing in Australia to actually go that next step to, you know, whether it be to make just battery materials, precursors, cells, or batteries themselves, or do some recycling. There's a lot of interest in Australia. We can therefore advance along that value chain, but we have to think pretty carefully about where that investment goes. You know, do we stop somewhere? Do we do it all? And if we do an individual step, why do we do it? And the one that often gets asked of us is, would Australia build little cells to compete with China and Korea and Japan? And I think the answer there is, would we want to? Would we rather instead build cells that worked and batteries that worked in an Australian environment for Australian applications, and with, you know, to improve our sovereign capability for defence and energy. Yeah, once again, we need to keep in mind that competition overseas and how we actually mesh with them. Can we become major suppliers into their industries as well? Because I don't think it's likely that we'll build special products for Germany, BMW to put into their electric cars. Northvolt in Sweden is more likely to do that. This is really also a discussion about jobs and growth. We've seen the Australian government come out very strongly recently in support of advanced manufacturing in Australia, and I think this is really part of it, and the jobs and growth aspect of it is so important. Otherwise, why would we be doing it? One of the things that came out of this work, because we gathered so much data from all over the place, is a thing that we're calling the battery map. And I'll give you just a moment to have a look at the screen. I've made a tiny URL, so it's really easy, tinyurl.com battery map beta. And if you click on that and just go and have a play, and I'd like you to crash test this, literally crash test it as much as you want, and get back to me and tell me what else you'd like to see in there. But when you go into there, you'll see a map of Australia, and that one's not terribly bright because the colours aren't coming out great, but you'll see some little dots. The dots on the screen can be clicked on, and when you click on a dot, this dot here, for example, gives a little window pops up and gives you some data about what's under the dot. And I would need to look at this one. There we go, it's the old cause operations. It's temporarily on hold. There's a feasibility study obviously running, and it's owned by Wingstar Investments and Dragon Mountain Gold. So you get all sorts of information out of just clicking on a dot. You can zoom in on a dot, and I'm just wondering if somebody in the room recognises that, Eddie. That's the Mount Keith operation at Mount Keith. And if you zoom in even more, there's a little spot there, and I don't know if this is going to work on our screen here, but there's a little spot up there with the processing plant that you can actually zoom in and have a look at everything that's going on. Now, I love looking at that kind of information. It's really cool. But you also get a lot of information also out of the little pop-up screen there that gives you information and website addresses, etc. Now, I've done this for all sorts of things to come. Prospective battery companies, processing plants all over the country, and any other information you would like to see on that, I will inject into it. So just get back in contact with me. And I think we are at the end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chris. If I could ask Jack to join us up on the stage here, and we'll take the opportunity for a couple of questions. So, Chris, perhaps if you sit in the middle.
I'll sit in the middle, wear my glasses.
So just to add my thanks to Chris and Adam for the work they've put into this project. It's an important one for the CRC, and as I indicated earlier, provides a solid foundation for us in the CRC's project development, in its advocacy of the opportunity, and creates a baseline to measure our impact as a CRC. So thank you, Adam. Thank you, Chris, for that work. In terms of questions, we have more than 50 people online, and we're starting to see questions come in, and I'd encourage you to do that. And that those we cannot get to today, we will get to, and in what we post on our website, we'll actually endeavour to keep the conversation going. But perhaps if I can start with one general question I might put to the report authors and also to Jack as well, having heard this. What Chris and Adam have suggested is really, in a sense, a deliberate and stepwise approach to identifying those parts of the value chain where there's opportunity. We're strong in mining, we're on the cusp of developing capability and producing purified battery chemicals, the next step, precursor manufacture. But if you step back and you really looked at this from the point of view of what's a moonshot project that Australia could take across battery industries that would make a substantive difference in capturing the scale of opportunity. Perhaps if I could start with that question and start with Chris, and then Adam, go to you, and then finish with Jack.
I was going to flick to Adam first, but that's okay. Look, I think moonshot is actually the pretty good analogy, because if you think about the way the moonshot happened, we did little things. We sent people into space. We orbited the moon. We then landed on the moon. And I think there's an opportunity here to test the waters with, for example, battery-grade materials. I mean, companies are already starting to move down that path, going into precursors. And we've got a couple of brave companies already that are talking about making actual cells in the country. So I think it does kind of look like that moonshot development. As far as the CRC and what it could support, I think you've done a really good thing already by supporting the electrochemical testing facility, which gives Australian manufacturers of battery-grade materials, precursors, anode materials, the opportunity to put them together in a cell and test them without being reliant on some third-party battery manufacturer overseas to tell you, yes, you've done a good job, or no, it's rubbish, or we're not interested. So I think that's a big step forward.
Thank you, Chris. Adam?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think recycling is the moonshot for us. As Chris indicated while we were presenting, we were working out how much dirt you actually have to move to actually produce a kilo of material in the last few days, and then when you kind of multiply that out to a gigafactory, it's literally eye-watering, and the amount of material just, we can't expect that to be a primary resource forever. So I honestly think that there's a massive opportunity for Australia to be potentially the Asia Pacific home for recycling, and use that to augment our natural resources. I agree with Chris, it's not competitive in any way, it actually augments our resources. It utilises our immense strengths in hydrometallurgy, pyrometallurgy, all of these different metallurgical processes which Australia is extremely good at, and I think that gives us that longevity of an industry, but also ensure that we have a circular economy, that this is really truly a sustainable technology for the longer term.
Thank you, Adam. Jack, do you want to have a stab at it too?
Yeah, well, it's firstly, I think if we just thinking about the moonshot and thinking firstly about the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, when they looked at, I don't know if you ever see the movie, where they with Tom Hanks, the documentary, where at that stage Russia was leading the space race, and they launched Sputnik, and they had the first person in space. And America was realizing that, they had to do everything basically from scratch very quickly. And they were basically starting from a position of being behind, at that stage, the leader, which was Russia. And I think for us, firstly, in Australia, we we're in a similar position. We realize there's a lot of potential, just as in the United States at the time, but there was, in our case, we've got China of the world, leading the pack. But we have to think that, it's just literally in the past 20 years that China got where it got, pretty much. And therefore, we've got the opportunity to move rapidly across the value chain. I think I think recycling is important. I think cathode materials is an enormous opportunity for us. If we go and we move from essentially where we've got individual metals which are linked to the London Metal Exchange in terms of prices, and suddenly you go into an engineered material, you go from, in a sense, a price taker to a price maker. Not totally, because naturally there are free market forces at work here, and you can't totally set your price, but you do have a significant opportunity to do that value add. And playing into particularly what we're seeing here with the federal government as well as their initiative of advanced manufacturing, I think there is a very real opportunity. Australia is good in manufacturing things that we can export as a powder. A powder is something that we put on a ship and we can send it to wherever we want to in the world. Shipping costs, once it's on the ocean, is fairly cheap. It's really producing that engineered material. And the interesting things with the cathode materials, for instance, the nickel, manganese, cobalt, aluminium type of chemistries, is with the same plant, you can actually swing your operation fairly easily, because that chemistry change is not the way that you manufacture it is basically a change in the recipe, but not a change in the process. And that's really a big opportunity for us to then produce the material and ship it to, particularly what I would believe, quite a discerning client base in Europe. I think Europe in particular for us is a big opportunity. And again, it gets back to our provenance, our labor practices, our ethical way of production, and our focus on good environmental practices. And to really use that to enter those markets is really important.
Thank you, Jack. We'll take one question from the online viewers and then come back to the room. But one of the questions online, and perhaps one for you, Adam, was to talk further about your rationale that cell manufacture in Australia is of low economic potential.
So I don't know that I'd say it's of low economic potential. I think you have to put it in the context of the competitive landscape in which it's going to occur. To be able to get to the economics of scale, I think is really critical, and then you have to be able to then consider the export markets that you're going to you would want to access. So once you've sold to everything you can get in Australia, then you're going to have to export. So if you're going to make something like an 18650 cell, the traditional cell chemistry type in the lithium ion space, you'd need to be able to export that and produce that at rates equivalent to the LG Chems, the Samsungs and others. So the question is, do you really want to compete on their turf when they've been doing that for 20 years and have got that down to such a fine art? The other point of that, of the exporting challenge, is that there's real significant safety challenges around the movement of batteries. And there are significant labelling and hazards associated with that, so you need to be able to consider that as well. And for this reason, a large number of the South Korean and Japanese companies are now setting up, and Chinese companies are now also setting up manufacturing capability in Eastern Europe so that they don't have to ship batteries those great distances. So I believe I agree with Chris, there is absolutely opportunities for us in the manufacture of batteries, cell chemistries in niche markets, specifically defence, sovereign capability, to support our own batteries in our own indigenous climate. We have a much, much hotter landscape here than you would have, say, in North America. We definitely don't have to design batteries that need to operate at -20 or -30 degrees Celsius. So the battery pack design, the cell chemistry can be tailored to actually address that challenge. And we can actually then do some unique things that actually are more suitable to the environment in which we live. So I don't see it getting to the point where we're going to have multiple gigafactories all over the country. There may be 2, maybe 3, and I think that would be great. It's a high value, high income, high talent, high skilled jobs, and they're the type of jobs we want in this country. But I don't see it getting to the point where we have 7, 10, 12 gigafactories. Chris may have an opinion.
In the interest of time, we won't give Chris the opportunity for an opinion on that subject. Thank you, Adam. Perhaps I can check if anyone in the audience has a question. If you raise your hand, there is a microphone which will come to you and be held at a socially responsible distance. Thank you, Chris. Maybe picking one of the other questions we've had come online and sort of generalising it. Is there a model in the way other countries are going after this opportunity which Australia should look to? Traditionally, as I think your report observes, Australia's had a relatively laissez-faire approach to industry development. There's clearly a pivot happening in Australia. We mightn't be picking winners, but we're actually setting targets in restoring manufacturing industry. Are there countries you think which we should look to borrow ideas or approaches from?
Carrot and stick. Adam can chip in anytime he wants, but carrot and stick always works. We've seen that in some countries, I'll say China, I'll just say China now, where there's almost been a military exercise that we will get into this business and we will become good at it. So, there's a mobilisation of the country that we cannot do. But looking at, for example, a lot of the European initiatives, if you go to Finland, there is a lot of cash on the table, but there's also the idea of, well, here's a battery park. So here's a massive area. We can guarantee that you're going to get your hydropower or your wind power or solar power, and we will make sure that it all works for you. So the infrastructure will be put in place. Just come and tell us where you want to put your gigafactory. So that facilitation by government is something I think we can learn from.
Adam, do you want to add to that with any observations you'd have?
Yeah, I think that there needs to be a decentralised approach to this around the country, because I think that there are mineral resources in different parts of the nation where there are probably processing activities are more aligned to be closer to those resources than trucking things all over the place. As soon as you have to start shipping things, it adds cost, and it'll actually make the final product less competitive in the bigger marketplace. So where we can set up these type of industrial parks, as Chris mentions, I think would be a very useful approach to things. I also agree with the carrot and the stick. We can continue to sell concentrate to China or to other places, but if we're just going to sell it at the concentrate, perhaps we need to tax it in order that it encourages miners to maybe partner with downstream processors to actually value add, but then reward them for that by saying, well, here, have this piece of land, or here, set up your factory here, or here, we'll do these things for you, to encourage people to move downstream to create more value from our natural resources.
Thank you, Adam. One of the other questions we've had come through online was around small-scale battery installation and the opportunities around the installation of storage and maintenance systems, really in creating jobs and opportunities, and perhaps a suggestion that could have got more attention in the value chain report.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons it didn't get more attention was because it's a little bit like buying an electric car. You buy a thing, you bring it, it gets serviced by whoever sold it to you, and it's not really part of the sort of open market within Australia at the moment. So we saw behind the meter storage as, it's a bit of a specialty. You import the parts, there's a service manual, and it wasn't really part of the Australian industry at the moment. But it could easily become part of the Australian industry if we had somebody here manufacturing and servicing.
Okay. I'm conscious that we invited you to a session that would finish at 11 o'clock, and we're very close to that time. Perhaps I'd give one final opportunity to all of our panel members for any general observations. Chris and Adam in particular have spent considerable time in lockdown, as Chris thinking about this and preparing the report. Arguably, Jacques spent nearly 2 years thinking about this since he got involved in working with our chair to lead the bid for the CRC Centre. So, general points that you might like to leave us with, starting with you, Chris?
I've been a value-add junkie sort of my whole life, so I see this as the great opportunity for Australia to grab and add value. We've got such an explosion in the industry around the world. Battery storage is not going to go away, but we're going to need more and more of it. We really need to hop on board and make the most of what we've got.
Adam, if we could throw to you.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with Chris. I was lucky enough to go with Jacques to Japan a couple of years ago. We took a delegation over there and met with a whole range of companies and presented the opportunities for Japanese companies to engage in Australia. And from that, we've seen significant engagement from Japanese companies with us. There is an absolute hankering for Australia to do more, to be able to provide better products and services as part of the battery value chain. And I think this is a real once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to not just dig it and ship it, but to dig it, value add it, create high quality, high value jobs that can to create even greater wealth for the nation.
Thank you, Adam. And I might leave the final word to Jacques.
Yeah, I think we are responding and positioning ourselves to a global change. I think when up to now we've seen a big dependence on just general commodities. People were, they wanted iron ore for steel and coal for steel making, and oil and gas for the vehicle industry, which is enormous globally. But we're seeing such a drastic change in the whole energy space that we don't have a choice but to respond in a sense. We have to position ourselves for this global energy move, and in that global energy move lies an enormous opportunity, which would be very, very sad if we missed the boat on not responding in time, and positioning ourselves on making use of our strengths. We've got very, very unique strengths here in Australia. To utilize those strengths and really play into the global market. I think it's one of those one-in-a-lifetime opportunities that we really have to grab and move with.
Thank you, Jacques. On behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank Adam and Chris for the work they put into the report. It really, as I said at the beginning, it will help inform the investment decisions of the CRC, how we measure our impact, but importantly, how we advocate for this opportunity in the way that Adam, Chris and Jacques just described. So thank you for joining us, but we see this very much as the start of the conversation. Both Adam and Chris are very much engaged in the CRC's work program. We'd welcome any further dialogue, input or discussion from the participants today. Again, thank you for joining us. For those who are in Perth, and if you have the time, please join us for the opportunity for networking and a coffee next door. And again, thank you for all in joining us this morning.